Okay, everyone, welcome to another episode of Raising the Bar, and I'm delighted to have this gentleman on the show. His name's Bart Sibrel. Bart is an award-winning filmmaker, writer, and investigative journalist who has been producing TV shows and films for over 35 years now. Notably, A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon, and the follow-up, Astronauts Gone Wild, and he's recently published a book, Moon Man: The True Story of a Filmmaker on the CIA Hit List. I'm going to be talking with Bart about his brilliant research and film projects blowing apart the moon landing narrative, which a lot more people are waking up to now. Bart, good morning. Welcome. Great to have you on the show, mate.
Oh, thank you, John. How you doing?
I'm doing really great, mate. I don't think I've ever been so excited to talk to a guest on this show before because I just think this is such a juicy subject. People, you've mentioned this before, people get very emotional around it. It's almost become like a quasi religion to a lot of people. It's almost part of their childhood, and they've based a lot of their reality around this deception. And you came along and you've blown this apart, haven't you? Most notably for me anyway, the viral videos that came out where you went up to these astronauts and you went to them with a Bible and you said, put your hand on the Bible and swear that you went to the moon. So you did that to all the different Apollo astronauts and famously got whacked by Buzz Aldrin, wasn't it? So I'd love to get into that with you if we do have any time. But I thought because we don't have long together, Bart, and I'd love to sort of, you optimize the time as best as possible. Would you mind just getting into it? What led you to the moon landing, story and narrative and breaking that apart? And, why do you believe it didn't happen?
Well, I grew up like everybody else did, except I believe there was a survey at the time in 1969. And at that time, 10% of the people doubted the authenticity. And people who tried to diminish the number of people who know that it was falsified, they quote a survey that's almost 25 years old over and over again. In fact, I just did an interview with Fox National News that's going to air shortly, and they brought up this survey from 25 years ago that said only 10% of today's people doubt the authenticity. Now, that's completely not true. It was 10% before they even went to the moon. They said, they're going to fake this. Adults said that. Now it's 25%, which they don't want to admit. Therefore, they quote a 25-year-old survey before my film came out, before this disclosure came out. Now, like everybody else, I believed that the moon landings are real. I mean, you assume people are telling the truth, including your government, until you know otherwise. And I more than believed. I worshiped the moon landings, like you alluded to, John, at the beginning. It has become a religion for people. I talked to a college professor who teaches aerospace at a major university, and he said, John, if he saw Neil Armstrong confess on national TV that the moon missions were fake, he would say that he believed he walked on the moon anyway. You see that? I mean, that's how, I guess, what's the right word, zealous or out of people's mind they are. They will not see the truth. They think they know better as a 10-year-old watching it in their living room on their television than a man who was there. And so my father was in the Air Force at the time. I was just 4 years old, asleep in bed. And a few weeks later, he got a VIP package of about 29 by 12 color prints of Apollo 11, allegedly people on the moon. And I had them as my cherished gift. And you imagine I moved about every 2 years from base to base. And wherever we went, prominent place in my bedroom, all together, side by side, this shrine to Apollo 11. So from the age of 4 to 14, that means I saw them 365 times a day, and probably 4 or 5 times a day, really, or at least 3,650 times. And then when I'm 14, I see a television program with a gentleman by the name of William Casey on it, who was one of the first guests on the Oprah Winfrey Show. And he says I had high security clearance at NASA. I edit these high security memos going from von Braun to the Pentagon because he doesn't speak English well. And I read a memo from him to the Pentagon warning them that there's a 99.99 chance that they will kill the crew if they try to meet the deadline, that they do not have the technology to do it. And so they bluffed, like in poker when you have crap, and you can win when you bluff, you see. And so I'm an open-minded 14-year-old when I hear this, and I'm like, oh, never thought about that. So I go back to my bedroom wall shrine, and the good thing is that the pictures they initially released showed a lot more detail of the fake backdrops than the current ones, which they have since color corrected. The original pictures, which if you can get from a library or maybe a book on eBay from like the early 70s, the soil of the moon in their pictures is a caramel brown, because that's the way it actually is. If you look at the real Chinese probes, the soil is caramel brown. And then the backdrop, I guess they made some error, was kind of a grayish blue. If you go to NASA's website, get new pictures, they corrected it. Now the soil is grayish blue and the background is grayish blue, so they'll match. But in the original pictures, you see left to right horizontally, this, caramel brown, and then suddenly left to right horizontally, it becomes gray. I'm like, oh, that's a fake backdrop. And it's like my eyes were wide shut. I never saw, because I never looked at them critically. I looked at them assuming they were real. And I thought, isn't that interesting? Well, fast forward another 10 years into the story, at the age of 24, I'd become a filmmaker. Now, a filmmaker's job is to make fake scenes look real. So I can tell you that they were absolutely shot with electrical light. In fact, you can prove that the moon landings are fake with one photograph. Just go to Sibrel.com. This is my last name, S as in Sam, I-B as in boy, R-E-L, Sibrel.com. Click on the top left button. Moonman video links are actually, this 4 clips of those are on the homepage. So I think right on the homepage, it says moon landing fraud in 3 minutes. And you can show the picture. It has shadows from sunlight, because the sun is 1,000,000 times bigger than the Earth, 93 million miles away. It's going to cast shadows in the same direction over an entire continent or moon. You and a friend just go outside in your front yard on a bright sunny day with no clouds, or look at 2 trees, 2 telephone poles, 2 people, whatever, and shadows always run parallel. They never intersect. It's impossible. And in the picture I show, which they claim was taken on the moon, the shadows intersect at 90 degrees from objects 5 feet apart. That's impossible in sunlight, which means it was taken with electrical light, which means it's on Earth. You can prove in a court of law that the moon landings are fake because they have shadows intersecting at 90 degrees from objects 5 feet apart, which cannot happen in sunlight.
Did they not have artificial lighting at all, Bart?
No, why would they? On the moon with no atmosphere, it's 20 times brighter than a desert at noon on Earth. I mean, the last thing in the world you would need would be a flash photography. I mean, come on, 20 times brighter than a desert at noon on Earth with no atmosphere. So, and then you don't have the power to power 800-watt lights and things like that. Anyway, so, and of course, they claim they were all taken in natural sunlight. In fact, they claim the iris was almost closed because it was so bright. And so, I mean, come on. I mean, it's right there, legally proving. Go to a court of law, get a declaratory judgment. Is this picture on the moon or not? And you'll say, hey, jury, let's go outside. Shadows are parallel in sunlight. Let's turn off all the lights in the courtroom except one spotlight. If you stand to the left of it, because the light is close, your shadow will go at 12 o'clock. And if you stand to the right of it, your shadow will go at 9 o'clock. There you go. We just proved that picture was taken with electrical light, which means they're on Earth, which means the moon landings are fake. And so I start looking into this, and as serendipity would have it, I'm editing one day a film for the guy who produced the TV show I saw 10 years earlier, with the man on it who said we didn't go to the moon. He puts me in touch with him, who suggests, as a filmmaker, that I produce a documentary about we did not go to the moon. I say, well, let me think about it. I take about 6 months off. I start seeing more shadows intersecting, find out 2 of the 3 astronauts on the first mission refused to give interviews. I find out the administrator of NASA resigned without explanation days before the first mission. The Soviets had 5-to-1 man hours in space. They did every space milestone first. The first satellite, the first animal, the first man, the first orbit, the first spacewalk, the first crew of 3, the first of 2 spacecrafts at the same time. So now fast forward another 5 years after I turned down the project, and I had a client I was working for one day who's a Christian musician. And they say that they'll get one of my screenplays to a famous Hollywood producer if I do them a favor. I'm like, sure, what favor? They said, read the Bible. I'm like, well, I have it there next to my thesaurus, a dictionary for writing, looking up something. I said, sure, I'll read it. So they give me a 1-year Bible that divides the Bible into 365 calendar days, which makes it seem kind of, doable. And over the next 5 years, I read the Bible 5 times from cover to cover. Now, I wasn't a Christian by any means. However, it did develop in me a conviction of right and wrong. There is right and wrong. There is good and evil. There is light and darkness. There are truth and lies. That's a fact. And things don't make themselves, right? You can't have the departmentalization of the human body that looks pretty much like a car engine, which was happened by accident. And just because you can't understand something doesn't mean it's not true. And that's what arrogant evolutionists say. Well, we can't comprehend an eternal being, therefore it must not be true. Or my dog can't comprehend a car engine either, but that doesn't mean it wasn't designed. And then you can't have a flower evolve and a bee evolve that are 100% dependent on one another, coincidentally, evolve and, only can survive with the other. That's design, whether you understand or not. And it makes sense, if there is a God, that there would be a judgment for the way that you live your life, and a separation between, basically what it boils down to is selfish people and unselfish people. That's really what it boils down to. And so I said, I'm going to die anyway. And if they fake the moon landing, just think about this, John. If they did fake the moon landing and murdered people to cover it up and lied to the encyclopedia and to the world and embezzled $200 billion, and this is the country that's supposed to be the greatest, that's actually more profound historically than if they had actually gone. Do you see that?
Agreed. Absolutely.
The faking of the moon landing is more profound historically than if they'd actually gone. And when you find out they really did fake it, you realize this hidden gem of truth is being withheld from mankind that they can grow from and learn from by this super minority of people who think they're better than everybody else. So I said, if this is true, this is important, I'm going to die anyway, so I might as well go out in a blaze of glory. And if you get my book, Moon Man, The True Story of a Filmmaker on the CIA Hit List, which is at Sibrel.com in audio, which I read myself, Kindle or print, you'll see I was followed, tracked, kidnapped, and drugged by the CIA by finding classified footage of fake photography from the first mission to the moon. And so I said, look, I'm going to die anyway. This is important. This is about right or wrong. I changed my mind. Well, as serendipity would have it, a few days later, I meet a millionaire who builds rockets for NASA, who knows the moon missions are fake and considered it his patriotic duty to give me $1 million to produce the films. Well, I'm still skeptical. I'm like, I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt until I know otherwise. It's like, I don't like people who say Kennedy was an adulterer. He's not here to defend himself. You know what I mean? Maybe true, maybe not, or whatever. I don't go there. So I'm like, I'm gonna still say they went until I know for sure otherwise, even though shadows intersect and weird things are going on here. Well, 3.5 years into the 7-year project, I'm doing exhaustive research, looking at every still, every picture, every video from just the first mission. I figured if they faked it, they're more likely to have made a mistake the first time they faked it, because they never faked it before. And lo and behold, I pop in a tape. It says at the beginning of it on the reel, on the screen, do not show to the public. I'm like, oh, that should be good. So I hit fast forward as I normally do, and I see the same shot for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes. It's a special effect shot. Now, the thing is time stamped by NASA's computer, and I think it knows what time it is, 2 days after they left for the moon. And they're on camera. There's Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, Michael Collins, and they're using a 1-foot model of the Earth to pretend that the Earth is floating in space as if they're halfway to the moon looking back at this part in the mission. And there's a third track of audio of the CIA telling them to fake a 4-second radio delay. So they pretend, through radio transmissions that they're farther away, when in fact they're still in Earth orbit. You can see the bright Earth out the window. They never left Earth orbit.
NASA claims that the Houston transmissions were the only ones taking place with the astronauts. Listen now as Houston Control initiates a conversation with the crew, only to find them too preoccupied with the behind-the-scenes trickery to respond. Moments pass and the oversight is picked up on by the clandestine third party, who quickly prompts them with talk. Immediately, Neil Armstrong speaks.
Hello, Apollo 11. Houston, Goldstone says that the TV looks great. Over. Okay, Roger. We're coming in on Earth.
Again, the illusion they are attempting to create is the Earth at a distance to demonstrate their far journey from it and their ability to survive passing through the Van Allen radiation belts. Understand, too, that only about 20 seconds of this raw footage was ever broadcast to the public, and these conversations discussing their deception were believed to be private, until now. Here they discuss that these television transmissions were in fact not broadcast live as everyone believed. They were first screened and edited for playback later.
Roger, Neil. We just wanted a narrative such that we can, when we get to playback, we can sort of correlate what we're seeing. Thank you very much.
As they perfected the shot, a crescent-shaped piece of black material was inset slightly into the window to create the illusion of the Earth's terminator line dividing night and day. This is a segment that they believed wasn't even being recorded, much less suitable for broadcast, for the lens was being zoomed out and the scene was being changed to that of an interior of the astronauts at work, and apparently the stop button popped back up on the recorder without notice. Here is the diffused work light that they used to see camera controls, but not throw light onto the spacecraft's wall. Here they remove part of the crescent insert. Finally, the iris is opened up and you can see the real location of the camera and the very bright and near Earth out the window. Here is the slate for the 19th of July, and the same shot of trickery on the 19th of July, and then the 20th, and the same misleading shot on the 20th. Later that evening, they were said to be walking on the moon. How can this be when they were in Earth orbit only 9 hours earlier, and the moon is some 3 days' journey away? Furthermore, if they genuinely went to the moon, why would they be faking any part of it? Why this trickery with the window? By faking being halfway to the moon, it becomes apparent that they did so because they could not even go halfway.
And what a surprise, 54 years later, they still cannot leave Earth orbit. You see that? They're sending mannequins to orbit the moon. So basically, we have 4 incontrovertible proofs. Each one would prove it in a court of law. We have 4 times the proof that would prove it. Number 1, shadows intersecting at 90 degrees from objects 5 feet apart. That cannot happen in sunlight. It's over. It's fake. One picture. End of story. Secondly, we found classified footage. See it for free. Go to Sibrel.com, click on the top left button, Moonman video links, go to the one that says smoking gun. I showed this footage to 2 news directors at NBC. They both agreed 100% it absolutely proves the moon missions are fake. You can imagine that. They said, look, one guy said, I don't want to have anything to do with this. This will cause a civil war. I'm not going to go down in history as the guy who caused the next American Civil War. The other person, the one in charge of NBC National News, said, we're going to do this as a breaking story, going to air it nationwide. They flew me to New York City, put me up in the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, paid me thousands of dollars for the exclusive license, ready to go, interviewed it. The whole program's edited, ready to go. They get a phone call from the federal government threatening them, do not broadcast this or you will regret it. Wow. So they back down. Okay, so you have that as the second proof, right? Then you have logic. Okay, think about this. Today, with 50 years better technology, the farthest that NASA can send an astronaut into space is to the space station, which is 1,000th the distance to the moon. It's only 350 kilometers or 250 miles above the Earth. So just pick a city that's 250 miles from you, make it vertical, and that's as far as they can go into outer space. The moon is 1,000 times farther. So what they're claiming is, in 1969, when all of NASA combined had 1/1,000,000th the computing power of a cell phone, they sent astronauts 1,000 times farther into space than they can send them today, 50 years later, with 5 decades of better technology.
We're also really pushing the boundaries in terms of where we're going forward with exploration. I think humans are naturally driven to do this, and this is really the beginning, I think, of human beings leaving low Earth orbit. I certainly plan on being around to see that.
Which is actually claiming that they had better technology, 1,000 times better, in the past than in the future. That's scientifically and historically impossible. That proves it in a court of law. There's no other instance in the entire history of humanity where technological breakthrough could not be repeated 50 years later and really should be surpassed, because when they blew up the first atomic bomb in 1945, just 10 years later, atomic bombs were 1,000 times more powerful. So if they could go to the moon on the first attempt with 1/1,000,000th the computing power of a cell phone, we would have been on Mars 10 years later. We'd be in another solar system by now, and there'd be bases all over the moon. And now we can only send mannequins to orbit the moon, when for some strange reason 50 years ago with 50-year-older technology, we can leisurely drive cars and play golf on the moon. So that proves.
Yeah.
And then finally, and this is really the crux of my book, Moon Man, at Sibrel.com, we have the deathbed confession of Cyrus Eugene Akers. He was the chief of security at the United States Air Force operations for intelligence and special ops. Every military branch has their intelligence special ops division, the CIA, if you will, of that branch of the military. Well, the CIA branch of the United States Air Force is at Cannon Air Force Base in Clovis, New Mexico, where Cyrus Eugene Akers was the chief of security. A few years ago, as he's dying, fearful of judgment, he confesses he's a murderer. He murdered a coworker at Cannon Air Force Base. He said the reason is because him and this coworker eyewitnessed the filming of Apollo 11, June 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of 1968 at their base as they stood beside President Johnson. And his friend thought it was morally wrong. He was going to tell a reporter to tell the world, and he was murdered by this guy to cover it up.
Project Slam Dunk was the name of this. President Johnson in 1968, okay? In Cannon Air Force Base in 1968, he said by the time he got there, that there was already 2 large hangars that were connected. There was hundreds of dump trucks that came in and dumped sand and stone, and cement powder was powdered over the top of all that to make it look like a lunar landscape. They had men that fashioned it into a lunar landscape, he said. Dad was one of 3 guards that guarded the inside of the front entrance. There was a list of 15 people who could enter. No one else was allowed by order of President Johnson. Anyway, President Johnson, Neil Armstrong, Edwin Aldrin, Werner von Braun, Robert Emenegger, Gene Kranz, James Webb, Joe Kerwin, Dr. Thomas Paine, Glenn Looney, Dr. Christopher Kraft, Dr. James Van Allen, General Trudeau, Lieutenant Colonel Donald Simon, and Grant Norrie. My dad, he raised me by the book. I know he didn't lie to me. And as I started seeing more and more of what he was telling me was true, I realized my dad wasn't lying. I lifted the lid off my dad's case, and you can see that his name is Cyrus Eugene Akers. He was born on July 17th, 1933. He died on September 28th, 2002. My dad, he raised me by the book. I know he didn't lie to me. And as I started seeing more and more of what he was telling me was true, I realized my dad wasn't lying.
You don't confess as you're dying, you're a murderer, right? And embarrass yourself. And he said the reason is to cover up the moon landing fraud, which was filmed at his base. All of this is in the book at Sibrel.com. When you realize, like I did, when I popped in that tape, which you can see for free at my website, you realize, oh my gosh, they really did fake the moon landing. And it was actually easy because there's no independent press coverage, right? It's not like World War II done on the earth in front of millions of people. They killed Kennedy in front of hundreds of eyewitnesses and got away with it. If the dead man's nephew, Bobby Kennedy Jr., who has more access to the JFK files than Oliver Stone, says his uncle was killed by the CIA, I believe him. And there were several things in my book that are not in my film. A funny thing happened on the way to the moon, which you can see for free on the homepage of Sibrel.com. That's the one that shows this classified footage for the first time. And we interviewed dead astronauts' relatives who say their relative, who was going to be the first man to walk on the moon, was murdered by the CIA because he wouldn't cooperate with corruption. And so they're murdering people. The government is. They're faking the moon landing. And then Robert McNamara, who was defense secretary during the Vietnam War, said that the whole reason the war began, the Gulf of Tonkin, the Pearl Harbor incident of the Vietnam War, never happened. He and the CIA made that up.
Yeah.
That led to the unnecessary death of 58,220 Americans. So if they're willing to kill their own president, willing to kill their own astronauts, willing to kill 58,220 of their own citizens, I think they're willing to fake an image on the moon. Don't you think, John?
Yeah. So when you put it all like that, Bart, I mean, it's irrefutable. I mean, it's actually laughable, the the official story. But when you start to talk to people about it, they have that immediate eye raise. They think you're crazy, conspiracy theorists, all that kind of stuff. We had a documentary on Channel 5 that kind of debunked the moon landing. It's actually pretty popular in the UK. I don't know if you've seen it. It was about 15 years ago.
I would think I was in it.
You probably were in it, yeah. But they were talking about absence of stars. They were talking about the flag waving. They were talking about they sped up the astronauts like bouncing around on the moon, and it just looked as just blatantly looked as though it was just slowed down. All those things as well, and the crosshairs of the camera. I think there were certain things that were underneath the or over the top of the crosshair of the camera as well. Are these also kind of relevant and significant in your work?
Well, yeah, we talk about this in the film. A funny thing happened on the way to the moon that you can see for free at Sibrel.com right on the homepage. The one that cost about $1 million that shows this classified footage. The problem with these programs is they have an agenda. For example, the former leader of the Russian Space Agency, which is actually more advanced than the U.S. Space Agency because we're using their rockets to go to the space station, right? They launched the first satellite, the first animal, the first man, the first woman, the first spacewalk, the first crew of 3, the first of 2 spacecrafts. Aside from allegedly going to the moon, they did everything first. And they're still a better space agency because we don't have a rocket to go to the space station, but they do. And we bum a ride with them, right? Their former director of the Russian Cosmonaut Space Agency said about 4 or 5 weeks ago, the Apollo moon missions are fake. 2 days later, Fox News calls me up to put out that fire. Fox News, who criticizes the government all the time, right? Controlled opposition, says, oh, we need to do a special about this. They tell me, okay, I'm the alleged expert they want to interview. I've just come out with a brand new book about it that has 16 interactive video links to back up everything I'm saying. They say before they interview me, before they read the book, before they look at the 16 video links, they say we're going to conclude the moon missions are real. I thought this was about investigative journalism. They've come to the conclusion before they investigated it. They said the whole purpose of the program is to reassure people that the moon missions are real. Can you imagine that?
We don't have journalism. We just don't have journalism
Yeah,
anymore.
exactly. I talked to the Washington Post when my film first came out. I said, well, what about that classified footage? And he says, it looks like they're faking being halfway to the moon. And I said, okay, well, then why would they do that if they really went? I mean, come on. And so I said, well, rather than doing a story, isn't it interesting that some people doubt the moon landings? Why don't you do a story about maybe the moon landings were fake, because here's them faking being halfway to the moon. The Washington Post, the guys who broke Watergate told me if I did that, I would be fired. So they would be fired if they exposed government fraud. Do you see that? And it boggles the mind. You know, whoever killed Kennedy, he's still dead. Whoever did 9/11, all those people are still dead. This is different. This is a positive lie. This is giving candy to a spoiled child. During the Vietnam War, when everyone was sad and complaining and protesting, Nixon said the greatest threat to America was people protesting the federal government, not China, not Russia, his own citizens protesting the federal government. He said we're the biggest threat to the nation. You give him a pep rally. Well, you know what Johnson's code name was for the fake moon landing, who was physically there the first day of filming? He called it code name Slam Dunk, because if you fake it, you can guarantee its success 100%. Becomes an easy slam dunk. And President Johnson gave Cyrus Eugene Aker, Chief of Security, Cannon Air Force Base, a list of 15 VIP eyewitnesses. These people and no one else are allowed in the visitor's door to observe. I got that list. I published it in the book. Some of those people are still alive. CIA people, NSA people, future past and former flight directors at NASA. 2 of the 3 astronauts, Van Allen and von Braun, and all these people were there watching them fake it. And this is a presidential document, and it's mind-boggling that this actually happened. That the government is so arrogant. So you see, whoever killed Kennedy, there's still that sadness and loss. Whoever did 9/11, the sadness and loss. But this is different. This is taking away something positive and giving them a turd in its place. You see, if an aerospace professor says even a confession from an astronaut admitting it was fake would not convince him it was fake, he'd still think he walked on the moon anyway. This has become an irrational obsession with people, the god of mankind. In fact, I opened my film with the Tower of Babel, which the Bible says was simply to boast. Look how tall our building is. It's taller than yours. We're the greatest. Never finished. And then we showed the Titanic, which they put in print. Get this, the ship that God himself could not sink. And then we showed Tricky Dick Nixon when he knew they were not on the moon. And he said on national TV, putting a man on the moon is second only in greatness to when God made the universe. When he knew they weren't there. You see that? This is a blasphemous event. How ironic that mankind's greatest accomplishment is a complete lie done by the nation that claims to be the most honest. How about that? How pathetic is that? And maybe the first news director was correct. If the public finds out that they got down on their knees and prayed, they wept, they waved their flag, they printed it in encyclopedias, they printed it on coins, they printed it on stamps, they gave them ticker tape parades, they gave them medals of honor. for being such good liars.
Yeah.
If the truth comes out about that, maybe it will upset people. Maybe it could, in a way, cause a civil war. Civil war, really, it's not, because we would be fighting each other. No, the first document of this nation is not the Constitution. It's the Declaration of Independence, which says we're starting this nation because, no offense, Great Britain, which is now a more honest government than we have here, believe it or not, it says when any government becomes destructive of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. Let's look at the first one, life. Gus Grissom was going to be the first man to walk on the moon. And days before he burned alive, he held an impromptu press conference and, without permission, invited a bunch of reporters to the top of the rocket, where he affixed a lemon the size of a grapefruit and called the thing a piece of junk. He said, we're a decade away, not a year and a half, from going to the moon. He says, this is not going to happen. A few days later, he dies in an accident. The day before he died, mind you, I interviewed his widow for 4 hours. Betty Grissom told me that on January 26, 1967, her husband, the man who was going to be the first man to walk on the moon, comes home from work and says, "Hun, for some strange reason, the CIA is all over the launch pad today, messing with the equipment. I wonder why. They've never been here before." The very next day, the guy is dead from, quote, faulty equipment, after he held a press conference making NASA look bad. You see, her son is a 747 pilot. I interviewed him for 3 hours. They are both convinced, they have forensic evidence, that that fire was set deliberately, that the man who was going to be the first man to walk on the moon was murdered by the CIA. Not my opinion, their opinion. The opinion of the dead man's nephew is that the CIA killed the president of the United States. So they are destructive of life, are they not? They're murdering their own people. They murdered all those thousands for making up the Vietnam War beginning, right? Then they're taking away life. That means we need a new government. What about liberty? You have to ask permission to go shopping, permission to go to church, permission to go to the beach, permission to open your business. Do you realize in California, a couple of years ago, if you have 5 people at your son's birthday party instead of 4, they will drag you off to jail, empty your bank account, and turn your electricity off because you didn't do what the government said. You can have 4 people at your son's birthday party, but not 5. Who are they to tell us what to do? I thought everyone was equal. Then the people who run the government are people. You know, back in the Founding Fathers' day, they said, we're your servant, public servants. There are masters. Yes, master. Can I open my business? I don't care if 9 out of 10 people are dropping dead. It's your right to open your business if you want to under those circumstances, and it's your right to go shopping under those circumstances, as risky as it might be. After all, 10% of the population is still alive and needs to buy toilet paper and tuna fish, right? Do you realize statistically, even if the numbers about these deaths from the last couple of years are true, you're more statistically likely to die in a car crash on the way to church than you are from picking up a deadly disease at church. So I guess we need to make cars illegal, right? You know, you got to move in walking distance of the church. You see, it's backwards. They are our masters. We are slaves. What's the best way of having a slave? To make them think they're free, the land of the free. This is anything but the land of the free. Do you think Congress and the Senate voted to fake the moon landing? No, they did it anyway. So voting, quote, democracy is a lie.
Yeah.
Do you realize that?
Yeah.
Do you think they voted to kill President Kennedy? No. I mean, that's election interference, and it wasn't by the Russians. It was by the United States government. I mean, 90% of Americans wanted to know whether their bottle of ketchup contained genetically modified organisms. 90%. Passed by Congress, vetoed by the president. Now, I thought a democracy was 51% having their way. 90% cannot have their way. The corporations won, the people lost, and 90% couldn't get GMO labeling. That is not democracy. That's the reality. All. And then we're told, get this, I'm sure you've heard it, we have the best health care in the world. The exact opposite is true. If you remove statistically heart disease, and cancer. The next leading cause of death, absolute fact, medical malpractice. Then we have 70% of the population taking prescription medicine. Well, that means 70% of the population is sick all the time. So wait a minute. If there's any country in the world that has 70% of the population continually ill, that country has the worst health care in the world, not the best. And then in Europe, you get university and medical care as a right. And here, if you don't buy insurance, you are fined. Do you realize my wife's health insurance is $10,000 a year after the government subsidy? And it's you pay the first $3,000 anyway out of pocket. I mean, this is outrageous. I mean, all the while we're told we have the best medical care in the world, and the moon landings are real, and Oswald killed Kennedy. I mean,
but basically, if this all came out, it would unravel the fabric of what makes America great. That's the main threat, isn't it? I'm gathering from all this, because the reason they did it, the reason they faked it, I'm guessing was for the prestige was the main one, to win the space race. But what else was there? Like, what were the other reasons why they'd want to do it? I mean, obviously you get a lot of funding from it, and it kind of led to other technological developments along the line. But I mean, what was so important about faking it, and what was the significance of doing it at that exact time?
Well, Kennedy set the goal. He's not a scientist, he's a politician, to go to the moon by the end of the decade. When that proved to be impossible, they wouldn't eat humble pie. And this means that our leaders are juvenile. They wouldn't admit that they bit off more than they could chew. They wouldn't admit they made a mistake. They set a goal that simply scientifically cannot be done then and can't be done today. Otherwise, men would be walking on the moon instead of mannequins orbiting it. And then money. In today's dollars, it costs $200 billion. They're only orbiting the Earth. That's about $50 billion to do that. So they had $150 billion left over. Congress passed a law in 1998 says the Pentagon must be audited within 1 year. 20 years go by, it's not audited. They just ignore the law. It boggles the mind. And then the day before 9/11, the defense secretary says, oh yeah, by the way, the Pentagon misplaced $2.3 trillion, $2,300 billion. I'm not sure where I put that. Well, it's all about the money. I remember, growing up in Nashville, Tennessee, going into this fried chicken place with no customers, never had customers, but they had a 20-line telephone, taking phone calls all the time. What was that all about? Well, it was a front for gambling. And so NASA is a front. During the Vietnam War, Congress said you cannot go into Cambodia and Laos. We're only funding Vietnam. Now they have the moon landing money. They can go into Vietnam and Laos. I mean, Cambodia, Laos, which they did. Many eyewitnesses say they were there in the military.
So they used that money.
Breaking the law.
What would you say about the objections, such as they collected moon rocks, which they've inspected, and lots of different organizations have looked at that. And what about if it was fake? Why didn't the Soviet Union criticize it and say it was fake then?
Yeah, I mean, these are very superficial questions that it takes, 1 inch of investigation to realize it's not proof at all. Yeah. First of all, the moon rocks, it's a felony to be in possession of one. Now, this is what Neil Armstrong says. He says he personally picked up this rock, put it in his pocket just for the Prime Minister of the Netherlands. He meets months later with the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, says, I was there. I picked up this rock off the moon surface. It's for you. They seal it in glass. They put it in a museum. The museum curator watches a funny thing happen on the way to the moon, and in the middle of the night goes, well, I wonder what this rock is like. So he opens it up. They figured it would never open. Puts it under a microscope. It's petrified wood. Yeah, it looks out of this world, but unless trees are growing on the moon, it's a fake. It makes the news. It makes the sideline news. Moon rock proves to be fake. Then what about the moon missions? And then the idea that Russia and China would blurt out the moon missions are fake. All you got to do is realize it's more valuable to blackmail us, right? I mean, if I had a picture of a world leader with a prostitute, I could upload it to the internet and ruin them, or make millions and millions and millions of dollars. And next year more, and next year more. I know somebody, John, who works in the command center of the Chinese Space Agency. He says everybody there knows that the moon missions are fake. We teach that it's fake in university.
Wow.
He says, but we are blackmailing NASA for technology in exchange for not exposing it. They've also never publicly said they were real either. Notice that one? It's their honor. They won't say it's real, and they have an agreement with NASA not to say it's fake if they give them technology. They're blackmailing them. That's what the KGB would do. When they have dirt on somebody, what do? Put it in the newspaper? No, they don't. They blackmail you. Let me answer another 2 questions for you. That their excuse is why they must be real. Well, it involved hundreds of thousands of people. Well, give me a break. That's like saying, you know, the person who made the glove or the boot or the door handle that the CIA told them, hey, you know, the moon missions are fake. Be sure not to tell anybody. That's like saying what the bank teller at Wells Fargo knows about corruption in the bank is the same as the CEO. No, they are clueless. In fact, the flight director, Eugene Krantz, said all those computers there, all those operators can tell no difference whatsoever between a simulation and an actual flight. It's just a bunch of numbers going by on the screen. How about that one? And then to say that there's reflectors on the moon that prove it. Well, that's just not the case. In 1959, Scientific American did an article where they're bouncing lasers off the moon with no reflectors because the moon is reflective in many, many areas. All they had to do is pick a landing site that's reflective and claim there's a mirror there. Also, the Soviets put an unmanned probe on the moon that has mirrors on it. So that doesn't prove anything either. The atomic bomb was made with 145,000 people, and only 8 people knew what they were making. So
it's compartmentalized. Yeah. So that's why.
Exactly. Yeah. Once the rocket goes up, how are you to say where they went? And get this. Imagine Bill Gates builds the first supercomputer. It cost him $200 billion, right? And when he's done, it works fantastic. He takes all the hardware, all the blueprints, all the software designs, and throws them in a furnace. Boy, that was great. That's what they did to the moon equipment. They admit it on camera.
I'd go to the moon in a nanosecond. The problem is we don't have the technology to do that anymore. We used to, but we destroyed that technology, and it's a painful process to build it back again.
Now, maybe you should have done that with the technology for the atomic bomb, but they didn't, did they? And 10 years later, atomic bombs were 1,000 times more powerful. They didn't give up that technology. If you really went to the moon, it cost $200 billion. It worked flawlessly the first time. You would never destroy a $200 billion investment. But if you were perpetrating a fraud, you know what you would do? You would destroy the hardware, the diagrams, the blueprints, the original videotapes, the telemetry, which is exactly what they did do, which is actually proof of the fraud. And so all of these things add up. And then you can see it for free at Sibrel.com, hence the name of my book, The True Story of a Filmmaker on the CIA Hit List, Moon Man. We found a recording during the follow-up film, Astronauts Gone Wild. I showed this classified footage to an Apollo astronaut, put up a TV monitor in his house. He turns beet red. Where did you get this? Starts cursing at me, literally kicks me from behind. In the commotion of being assaulted by exposing the moon landing fraud, I left a wireless microphone on him, and my camera operator, a little rattled, forgets to hit stop record. So while the camera is in the back seat of the rental car in the guy's driveway, he's inside his house with the door closed, talking to his son, and they're discussing whether or not to call the CIA to have me assassinated. Now, if they really went to the moon, and I'm some silly person who thinks it was done in a TV studio, why would the CIA care?
Absolutely.
And why does an astronaut on an alleged civilian mission have the CIA in his Rolodex? Because the list of people who were there were CIA people. You have William Benny, going on national TV. He worked at the NSA for 30 years. He goes on national news, says, oh, by the way, we spy on the private cell phone conversation of Supreme Court justices in order to get financial and sexual impropriety on them so that we can blackmail them to vote the way that we tell them to. They didn't publicize it, did it? So it's an established fact, John, that the NSA, CIA is blackmailing Supreme Court justices, and there's not a single investigation. In fact, when Bernie Sanders, who is getting more votes than Hillary Clinton, but she's getting more delegates anyway, when it's leaked out that that was rigged from the beginning, instead of the FBI going after rigging an election, they go after the person who released the information. I mean, my goodness, you cannot even get to William Benny's website, williambenny.com. You cannot, it will not let you get to it. Unsafe or whatever, the excuse is. This is our country. Supreme Court justices are being blackmailed. Presidents are being shot in broad daylight. Moon landings are being faked. Wars are being started through, fake CIA contrived reasons. And everything moves merrily along and gets worse and worse. No one does anything about it. This is why they constantly produce documentaries to reassure people that the moon missions are fake. Type in Google, moon landing fraud. You don't get moon landing fraud. You don't get me. You don't get the secret footage. You don't get the deathbed confession of an eyewitness. So type in Google, moon landing fraud. You don't get anything about the fraud. You don't get me. You don't get shadows intersecting. You don't get the classified footage. You don't get the deathbed confession of an eyewitness who saw them faking it. You get 1,001 homes to reassure the public that the moon missions are real, and I'm wrong. And this is the thing. Maybe the news director was right. Even though, 9/11 killed more people, the Kennedy assassination witness list apparently knocked off 200 people, right? Maybe 20 people were killed to cover up the moon landing fraud. May have killed the fewest number of people, but it's the most dangerous for the government if the truth comes out, because it's burned in people's hearts. They cried, they prayed, they waved their flag. If they find out the government is so arrogant to have lied unnecessarily about something like that, maybe the news director was right. Maybe it would cause the collapse of the government, the stock market, the dollar. I say you have to cut off gangrene. And if you don't, the body's going to die. You got to face facts. And the government did fake the moon landing. I was the biggest fan. Come on. I worshiped it. And I had to face facts. You can't have 1,000 times greater space traveling technology in 1969 than today. People don't lie and say they're a murderer as they're dying, and they killed a guy to cover up the moon landing fraud unless it's true. You can't have shadows intersecting at 90 degrees in sunlight. It means electrical light, and you can look up the secret footage. The lights come up, and it's a 1-foot model of them faking being halfway to the moon of the Earth, with a third track of audio audibly heard of the CIA tell them to fake a 4-second radio delay. They fake going to the moon. I'm sorry.
Were the astronauts then, were they actually real astronauts, or were they just actors then? I mean, it just seems as though the whole thing was staged, or how involved were they in the deceit of the whole project?
Well, in the first one on the visitors list was Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. So they weren't even in the suits. In fact, I got some information recently that the guy who played Kato in the Green Hornet, Bruce Lee, they needed somebody with incredible physical stamina to be in those spacesuits with no air conditioning units, which had to be removed. Otherwise, they'd fall over backwards. And the reason why the flag waves is because they were pumping in tons of air conditioning. And apparently, Neil Armstrong was not even in the spacesuit. Another interesting thing, I went to NASA's archives. I'm talking about a walk-in vault with the original Apollo 11 pictures. And I said, hey, guys, can you show me just one picture, or most famous thing, standing on the surface of the moon? Here I am. They went in and out, scratched their head, in and out, scratched their head. There's not a single picture of Neil Armstrong standing on the surface of the moon during the most famous mission of all time. He refused to have his picture taken. You see, and the TV image of the two little guys wasn't even him. He's literally trying to distance himself from it. It boggles the mind. There's actually only like 15 pictures of an astronaut standing on the surface of the moon during the first mission. They claim there's thousands of pictures, but most of those are on the ground of the launch, shots of the Earth in outer space.
So just to summarize, then they filmed the actual moon landing stuff in a studio a year before, and that was with different actors or with Neil Armstrong and Buzz.
No, he was just observing. He was on the visitors list. Right. He wasn't in the suit. He just came in to watch it so that he could recount it, memorize it better. Interestingly, Michael Collins was not there because they didn't want him having knowledge of it because he wasn't supposed to be there. He was supposed to be orbiting.
So what were they told? Well, they said, look, you've just got to go along with this, sign the NDAs, whatever, and like that's it, and blackmail them, or were they even under some kind of mind control? Or
no, I'm sure they considered mind control, but that's not reliable enough. Someone could snap out of hypnotism. You need a sober person to lie to this degree. And I can tell from at least some of the other astronauts I interviewed in Astronauts Gone Wild, the follow-up film, in which I'm kicked, punched, and threatened to be killed, that they had acting classes because I'm an actor and teach acting and filmmaker. And so they knew exactly what was going on. Now, when they murdered the first crew and Neil Armstrong, substitute, comes next in line, I suspect he didn't want to have anything to do with it. I mean, look, he didn't want his picture taken. He never gives an interview. And on the 25th anniversary, he said, maybe someday you'll be able to remove one of Truth's protective layers. Hint, hint. And so I think he turned it down. But they cannot have the guy the public knew was going to be the next man to be the first to walk on the moon resign. It'd be too suspicious. So they bribed him. It doesn't matter. And they threatened his life. He's a test pilot, flies experimental aircraft. I don't think that means much to him. So then you have to threaten the life of his family, you see? And then he did it. And, a lot of people, John, are convinced because I only show it for like 10 seconds and a funny thing happened on the way to the moon. Their expressions at their first and only press conference. They look like they're at the funeral of their mother instead of the locker room of the winning game after the Super Bowl.
They should be. Yeah. Should be triumphant.
You can tell they don't like being there. They don't like lying. You can see it crystal clear on their face.
Buzz Aldrin, he always looks drunk, whenever you see him talk, with the interviews. And he's even come out and said, little girls asked him a question. He's like, well, we didn't go there. And
why has nobody been to the moon in such a long time?
That's not an 8-year-old's question. That's my question. I want to know, but I think I know. Because we didn't go there, and that's the way it happened.
It's just like a strange thing to say, whether it's a Freudian slip or it just sounds so out of context. It just sounds ridiculous, like he's admitting it. But he doesn't come across lucid. He comes across as if he's sort of masking his words behind this sort of drunken facade to kind of cover up a little bit. I don't know. It just seems weird with him.
Well, you have to keep in mind this book at Sibrel.com, audio, which I read myself, Kindle or print. It took me 15 years to write, 2 years to edit. We have an eyewitness who was there that's being exposed for the very first time. This book reveals the code name, the location, and a list of 15 people who were there by President Johnson's order. This is a presidential document we're publishing, which proves the moon landing fraud. When I'm confirming this information with his son, less than 2 years ago, John, the guy's house is broken into by government agents, take everything that belonged to his father, the other house that had the videotape in it of his father's confession burned to the ground, and then days later, they come to him face to face and say, if he ever talks to me again about the moon landing fraud, they will kill him and his family. This is less than 2 years ago. I contacted a senator on the Intelligence Committee, the White House press secretary, and the regional FBI to get this guy protection. Buzz Aldrin needs to be more concerned that they will take him out before he babbles once again and accidentally admits the moon landing fraud is fake. Imagine their fear of that. In 1991, one of the Apollo astronauts called investigator Bill Casing, who I first interviewed, said he had become a born-again Christian, and he had something very important to say about Bill Casing's claim of the moon landing fraud. He said, "I'm concerned for my safety. Call me at this number 3 days from now." And on that day, he was dead of a fatal heart attack.
Wow.
So the astronauts are in great danger, and the only way to protect themselves is to confess.
Yeah. Ooh, yeah, they're in trouble. Could you quickly talk about the meeting with Buzz and the punch, just because it's such a iconic moment, and what was that like? Because you also did interview him separately, didn't you, in his home?
Well, it was in an office. Basically, after we found this footage, and the first film came out, I guess from watching courtroom dramas as a kid, I thought, well, why not track him down? Why don't you swear on the Bible that you walked on the moon?
Please.
Why don't you swear on the Bible that you walked on the moon? You're the one who said you walked on the moon when you didn't. Calling the kettle black, if I ever thought of it. Saying I misrepresented myself.
Away from me.
You're a coward and a liar and a thief. And even prior to that, I got an interview with Buzz Aldrin, and I put up a television monitor, had 2 professional cameras, and showed him the fake footage, which he participated in, of faking being halfway to the moon. Now, my production company at the time was called ABC Digital, really just to appear first in the yellow pages. He thought I was with ABC News, which I never said. I never even thought he made that assumption, but he did. So when he thought ABC News comes with 2 professional cameras and sets up a monitor of showing him the fake footage of pretending to be halfway to the moon with a 1-foot model, he said, "Where did you get this?" "Oh, this makes you some real famous reporter for having discovered this." Well, that's an admission. How could I become famous unless if it proves nothing? You see, that's an admission that I'm correct. And then he said, "Talk to the administrator of NASA. We're just passengers." Him and Neil Armstrong, he called passengers, not pilots, you see. So he admitted twice that I was correct, that the moon missions are fake. And when he realized that, he said if I showed this to anybody, he would sue me.
I can't believe it. If you show this publicly, you're open for a lawsuit. Okay?
Well, come on. He's never going to sue me. We have his 2 admissions in this film, Astronauts Gone Wild, which you can see for free at Sibrel.com, which is one of my links in Moon Man. I write a chapter. I say, go to link 1, another chapter, link 2. We have Kelly Smith from NASA saying that the radiation belt that surrounds the Earth that most people don't even know exists, 1,000 miles above the Earth, 30,000 miles thick, that every manned mission has been well below, except going to the moon. He says the technology to survive the radiation going through it to the moon and through it again back has yet to be invented.
We'll pass through the Van Allen belts, an area of dangerous radiation. Radiation like this could harm the guidance systems, onboard computers, or other electronics on Orion. But Orion has protection. Shielding will be put to the test as the vehicle cuts through the waves of radiation. Sensors aboard will record radiation levels for scientists to study. We must solve these challenges before we send people through this region of space.
Which means they didn't go to the moon.
Of course.
And so I'm like, oh, let me call. I call up the guy. Let me talk to him. They say, well, he doesn't give interviews anymore since he put his foot in his mouth. And I said, well, you sent unmanned probes into that radiation belt recently with 2 Geiger counters, obviously to measure the radiation, which you should have already had the radiation results from, 50 years ago, from 6 tips through it to the moon and back. And I said, well, what are those Geiger counter readings? It's a, government funded project, non-military, civilian. What are the Geiger counter readings? It says it's a classified secret. I'm like, well, wait a minute. When you send a probe to the sun to find out the temperature of the sun isn't a secret. It's just nature. And when you send a probe to Jupiter to find out how much helium is in Jupiter's atmosphere, the amount of helium isn't secret. It's just nature. So why would the amount of radiation that surrounds the Earth in this 30,000 mile thick field that most people don't even know exists, that you have to go through to reach the moon, why would that be a secret? It's just a part of nature. And they said no comment. Well, because it proves it's 100 times beyond a lethal dose, and they do not have yet the protection to go through it, as their own engineer admitted. The technology necessary to survive a trip to the moon and back has yet to be invented.
Exactly.
So it certainly wasn't invented with 1960s technology that predates the cell phone, microwave oven, and had 1 millionth the computing power cell phone.